Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we're discussing Game 2 of the regular season between the San Jose Sharks and the Colorado Avalanche, in which the Sharks have lost 2-1 in the shootout. Now, this was a pretty interesting game to watch, not because the Sharks played exceptionally well, not even because this was a back-and-forth game. In fact, it was mostly just a fourth game, so to speak, as the Avalanche controlled the pace of this one for the majority of it, and yet it was very reminiscent of some of the games that the Sharks used to play and what they used to do to other teams back during their more dominant years during the 2000s and 2010s. During those seasons, they'd put up 50-plus wins, 100-plus points, and yet they'd occasionally come up against teams like the Buffalo Sabres or the Edmonton Oilers right near the bottom of the standings. They'd get like 50 shots on net, and yet they'd end up losing those games like 2-1 or 1-0, things of that nature. And the Sharks attempted to do that to the Avalanche here tonight. For the vast majority of this game, it seemed as though the Sharks were going to close out a 1-0 shutout victory off the back of Thomas Bordeleau's first career goal scored back in the earlier parts of the game in the first period. And this held on for a very, very long time until the last 90 or so seconds of the game. Cale Makar would tie it up and would eventually force the overtime. The Sharks during the overtime had a few interesting lineup combinations. I'm always very intrigued by what exactly are the trios sent over the bench by David Quinn, and to start off they immediately put on Nico Sturm, which is not that much of a surprise considering he was mostly there just to win the faceoff, and as he did so, he immediately went to the bench. They also had Anthony Duclair there, which I think is a smart move since his game definitely excels in the overtime due to his speed. But what was probably the most odd choice, but one that I didn't hate either, was the defenseman on the back end in this trio was actually Nikolai Knyzhov, who stepped into this game in place of Henry Thrun, something I will talk about a bit later. So that was definitely a note of confidence for Nikolai Knyzhov. And they relatively quickly then ended up transitioning to a front duo of both Bordeleau and Eklund, which was also a very nice move, I found, by David Quinn, showing that he is willing to play these younger players in very, very tense situations against an extremely skilled Colorado team. So I definitely liked the overtime situations here for the San Jose Sharks. Unfortunately, there would be no goals either way. The Sharks would actually have a full 2-minute power play in the overtime that they could not convert on. The Avalanche would get about a 30-second power play in the overtime to finish it off, which they also couldn't convert on. But in the shootout, the Sharks had 3 opportunities, could not score a single one past Georgiev, and Mikko Rantanen would get the only shootout goal of the night to win the game for the Avalanche. The Sharks would still get a point in that effort, which is good news to some and bad news to others, and that would be how the game would finish. So very, very close to a steal of the century, and unfortunately the Sharks would end up losing in the end. Moving on to the lineup, there were a couple of changes after the Vegas opening night game in which the Sharks' first few lines didn't exactly look great. There was a bit of shuffling. On the first line, it was Duclair replacing Hoffman with Hertl and Zadina, and I thought this was definitely a better performance here. It should be noted that when we talk about the 12 forwards here tonight, the the criteria that I'm going to be using to evaluate them is going to be relative to how sort of the Sharks as a whole looked in this game, because it is quite obvious, considering the Avalanche put up 50-plus shots in this one, controlled the vast majority of this game, that none of these forwards for the San Jose Sharks were world beaters here tonight. None of them were particularly amazing. There was no player who was able to come in every single shift and just dominate the offensive zone, because very rarely did the Sharks even find themselves stepping foot into the offensive zone. But relative to the rest of the team, I don't think any of these players were necessarily terrible, and so it's interesting to still look at them anyhow. And so starting off with this first line, I thought it was definitely a better performance than what they had in the previous game against the Golden Knights. Hertl, who I thought did not look good against Vegas, I thought started this game a bit slow, but as it went on, picked it up, was pretty solid defensively, which was nice to see, and had a couple of okay looks offensively. Zadina, I continue to really like, a very hard worker on this first line, doesn't, continue the goal scoring that he had, as the Sharks now go 1 goal in their first games, 1 goal in their second game, which is not exactly a recipe for success. But Zadina, solid game for himself, and Duclair, who has been really just a disappointment ever since arriving to the San Jose Sharks, is slowly beginning to ramp up, I would say. A better performance here tonight, still definitely not near the level that you were hoping for from Anthony Duclair, but perhaps he can build on some of the decent things that he did here tonight moving forward. When it comes to the second line, we had a massive change up here as well. First of all, Granlund not in the lineup at all. This is because actually what happened in the Vegas game is that he re-aggravated a preseason injury very early on into this one. That could perhaps explain for why he looked really bad in that Vegas game. So he ends up getting replaced by Thomas Bordeleau, bumped up to the second line, and then Cunnin ends up getting swapped out for Mike Hoffman, dropping down from the first line. And speaking of Hoffman, who I thought was quite bad against Vegas, not really doing anything, Hoffman had a better game here tonight for sure. I continue to obviously be nervous about Hoffman in the defensive zone just because of what was said about him as a player coming into this season, and yet even in a game where the Sharks played about 80% of it in their own defensive zone, it didn't feel as though Hoffman was that much of a liability, or at least not much more of a liability than anybody else on the team. So that was actually quite nice to see, and he actually had a couple of very good plays as well, and there is a certain amount of trust being shown towards Mike Hoffman, because as the Sharks are going with that five forward power play unit, with Mikael Granlund out of the lineup due to injury here tonight, Mike Hoffman was actually put into that defensive quarterback spot, which is, fine for the skill set that he has, but it also means he's the one man back in case of a shorthanded break. And you would think coming into this season having Mike Hoffman in that position wouldn't be a recipe for success. And even though there were multiple shorthanded breaks that the Colorado Avalanche actually ended up getting in this game, I thought Hoffman did a decent enough job, at least as a forward, in defending against that. So certainly very nice to see. When it comes to the rest of this line, of course, Thomas Bordeleau, some praise needs to be levied towards him due to the fact that he scored his first career goal. Certainly congratulations there. There was also a brief scare in the early parts of the second period, gets hit into the boards by Miles Wood, but as the gate to the bench was open, which is always a very, very awkward situation where you could get really hurt and really injured if things go poorly, and it looked like that was exactly the case. Unfortunately for Bordeleau, he left very hobbled off the ice, helped off by the Sharks trainer, and yet just a couple of minutes later was right back on the Sharks bench, right back on the ice actually. So a very, very scary moment avoided by Thomas Bordeleau, who I thought, like in the Vegas game, had a pretty solid game, continues to improve defensively, which is a very critical skill to have, especially this season for the San Jose Sharks, where honestly they will be playing in the defensive zone a lot. So it's nice to see that not only Bordeleau was able to improve in that regard, but also be able to capitalize on the few chances offensively that the Sharks are bound to be getting in these games, as he, of course, as I mentioned, scored the one goal for the Sharks tonight. And then when it comes to William Eklund, honestly, a bit of a disappointing performance in my eyes for William Eklund. There have been a couple of games, the Vegas one previously, as well as one of the preseason games that he played, where he didn't necessarily look at his best, but even in those games, he managed to actually contribute with a few very nice plays here or there, and I didn't really find that same feeling tonight when it comes to Eklund. Now, he wasn't terrible. I don't think he was making garbage defensive plays or anything like that where he immediately needs to be benched, healthy scratched, get him out of the lineup. He's not worth it. I think he definitely still deserves to be playing in the NHL, obviously, and there were still some offensive moments, but his power play performance was somewhat shaky. Honestly, most of the power play performances from all of the Sharks players were very shaky here tonight, and just generally didn't exactly blow me away as he has in the past thus far this season and into the preseason. Then when it comes to the third line, of course, another change up here with Bordeleau getting bumped up and Granlund coming out of the lineup. We needed a new face, and that new face was Jacob Peterson, a player who had shown a lot for the San Jose Sharks at the end of last season, but then was just doing absolutely nothing for them in the preseason, and as such started the year in the AHL. He gets called up in this situation, as the Sharks did require a center. That may be the reason why LeBanc doesn't step into the lineup for this situation. He plays. I thought he was decent enough in this one. Again, it was very difficult to shine in this game. There was no extended offensive zone time for pretty much any of these lines, barring like a couple of moments. And so it's hard to really have shown off if you are Jacob Peterson, but there were a couple of okay plays, I guess. Nothing really deserving of like holding a spot over really anybody else, but I guess as long as Granlund remains on the IR where he currently finds himself, Peterson is not a terrible option, and it'll be interesting to see perhaps against a weaker opponent what Peterson can do. Hopefully he can ramp up better than what he did in the preseason. His two wingers in this game were Barabanov and Luke Kunin, who both had sneaky good games, I guess you could say, again, relative to the rest of the field here tonight. Nothing consistent from those two players, but they had a few very good moments. Kunin had a great chance, as per usual, from his office, which is, of course, the slot. He had an opportunity to score. At that point, I believe it would have made it 2-0 San Jose, which maybe at this point, with how well Blackwood was playing, would have been enough to win the game. And Barabanov also a couple of very nice skilled plays in the offensive zone, and I also specifically want to point out a very, very nice play he made in the overtime in that situation. Was trying to fend off Cale Makar, one of the best defensemen in the NHL, primarily for his offense, but still no slouch defensively at all, and yet he manages to fight off Makar for a good chunk of time, feeds Fabian Zetterlund, who ends up drawing the penalty that put the Sharks on the power play in that overtime. So very, very nice play for sure by Barabanov, who I thought had a better game here tonight than he did against the Vegas Golden Knights a couple of nights ago. And then finally we have the fourth line, who was perhaps the Sharks' best line in their home opener against the Vegas Golden Knights, and they continued to do some very solid things for San Jose. The big positive that you can give for this fourth line is that they push the play forward. There's not a ton of great chances being generated, though occasionally Zetterlund had a really good one, I believe, in the late parts of the second or the early parts in the third. I don't exactly remember when it was, but a lot of times you're seeing like Sturm take shots from far out or Giovanni Smith taking shots from far out. But what this does is that it's not necessarily going to amount for an actual goal, but it gets the play in the offensive zone. It keeps the puck in the offensive zone, and as they say, the best defense is a good offense. However, it should be noted that when they weren't in the offensive zone, it can be said that the best defense is a good defense as well, and these three players together didn't exactly play that well defensively. There was this one moment where they got caught on the ice. I believe Sturm wasn't involved in this, but both Smith and Zetterlund were, and they got caught on the ice for over 3 minutes in the defensive zone with an icing in between that. So that was definitely a bit of a difficulty to deal with. They had some issues getting the puck out, which is again a theme for the San Jose Sharks this season, but they were otherwise a solid enough line for the San Jose Sharks. They got a couple of chances each way, which is all really what you can expect from your fourth line, as I've mentioned in the past. On the defensive side of things, this is a bit of a difficult game to evaluate defensively because, of course, as mentioned, the Sharks spent most of their time in the defensive zone, which you would think it means that the defense are having issues clearing the puck out. They're not being able to push it forward, which are all very, very true facts. But the thing is here is that when the Avalanche were actually in the offensive zone, prior to at least the third period where they really started to ramp things up and actually get some great chances, they weren't really able to generate a ton of opportunities against Blackwood. As good as Blackwood was through those first 40 minutes, he also had a ton of help from the defense in front of him, who were obviously giving up zone time but not giving up a ton of chances. And so if we take a look at the first pairing here of Ferraro and Burrows, I thought Ferraro did yet another very solid job in the situation that he is currently finding himself in, and that is definitely continuing to be an improvement from what we saw from him last season. Kyle Burrows is an unsung hero, I guess you could say. I don't think he was amazing, but he was certainly solid enough against an extremely strong Colorado team. From the second pairing, it obviously should be noted that Vlasic did not play the majority of this game, got injured in the last few minutes of the first period, which funnily enough wasn't even really noticed by the Sharks commentators until the last few minutes of the second period. That just kind of shows the impact that Vlasic has on the ice. But the fact that the Sharks were running with 5 defensemen for the majority of the night is very impressive for the performance they actually ended up putting up in this situation. So definitely pretty good. When it comes to Matt Benning, Vlasic's defensive partner, who ended up having to flex with multiple other players, Benning also a very heroic performance, I guess you could say, here tonight, kind of similar to Mario Ferraro, doing a lot and not exactly giving an inch to the Colorado Avalanche. And then when it comes to the final pairing, Jan Ruda had some issues. He was also one of the defensemen caught on in that extended 3+ minute shift with the icing that I mentioned when it came to Smith and Zetterlund. So that wasn't great. And Ruda had a couple of issues in this game for sure, but I thought he wasn't terrible either. And then when it comes to Knyzhov, as I mentioned, replacing Henry Thrun in the lineup here tonight, usually in the past when David Quinn has replaced a younger player with somebody else, I mean, to be fair, Knyzhov is also a pretty young player, but Thrun is like a rookie who you're really looking for. I've been upset because I've usually felt it wasn't really deserved, but here this substitution absolutely deserved. Thrun had an just not a good game at all against the Golden Knights a couple of nights ago, so it certainly makes sense to put in Knyzhov over him. And I thought Knyzhov's performance was certainly quite good and definitely good enough to warrant yet another game, so I imagine he doesn't get pulled out of the lineup. However, with the previous injury, as I mentioned, to Vlasic, it is still possible for Thrun to find his way into the lineup. It depends on how serious the Vlasic injury is. If it is indeed going to be keeping Vlasic out for an extended period of time, Thrun is obviously the next up in line, and hopefully he has a better performance because, of course, while both McDonald and Shemek sit on the sidelines currently with an injury, they are not exactly too far away from returning, and Thrun's spot with that opening game is beginning to look like it's in jeopardy. And then finally, we have the goaltender Mackenzie Blackwood here tonight, making his Sharks debut in the preseason. He didn't look fantastic, and in the early parts of this first period, I already had some criticism ready to go for my game review, but then as the game went on, of course, he ended up putting up some just absolutely immense saves. Fantastic game for Blackwood, and it just feels unfair at this point to give him that criticism, so I'll save it for a later time if it continues to crop up. At this point, the only thing to be said about Blackwood is that this was an amazing game. Unfortunately for him, he was not able to hold out for long enough. This was a very tough save on Makar for sure. While it obviously looks like it just went clean in, no deflections, he had to look through about a sea of like 3 or 4 bodies. Benning didn't have a stick because it broke. Just a really awkward spot for Blackwood to be in, but he made so many amazing saves prior to that. As I mentioned, while he was helped out a lot in the first couple of periods, the third period things started to fall apart a bit. Blackwood held strong, had actually a very good save against Makar earlier on in the third period before the Makar goal, and then of course in the overtime also did some very good things, especially on that last 30 seconds power play for the Colorado Avalanche. So of course, with Kakinen having a pretty weak game against Vegas and Blackwood having a very good game here tonight, it's quite clear who will get the next one up. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Tuesday, and as I mentioned, Blackwood should be getting that one, and we'll see if the Sharks can finally get a win on the board. Class dismissed.